Hello everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Beis, and we will be learning today, Mirz Hashem, Daf Lamed Daled Amud Aleph. But before we get to Lamed Daled Amud Aleph, we have some leftover business here on Lamed Gimel Amud Beis. We need to finish Siman Kuf Nun Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Beis HaKnesses. We started Sif Yud Beis in the previous share, but we really just started it, got into it a little bit. I'm going to start again from Sif Yud Beis, and the truth is that looking over Sif Yud Beis over Shabbos and allowing Sif Yud Beis to percolate in my mind over Shabbos, I have a little bit of a different ice cook, a little bit of a different outlook on the Sif. So I really do want to start the Sif over again. So what we're discussing in this Sif is the halacha of an aliyah, a second floor located above a shul. And the Mechaber starts here in Sif Yud Beis, and he tells us, Yesh li zaher, we should take care, milehishtamesh ba'aliyah she'al gabe beis hakneses, from using a second story located above a shul, tashmish kavua shel gnai, with a tashmish kavua, an ongoing permanent usage that is the usage of gnai. And what the Mechaber picks to depict a tashmish shel gnai, he says, kigoin lishkav sham. For example, to lay down over there, to go to sleep over there. That's not appropriate for a story above a shul. Now, I spoke out in the previous year. If you take a look at the Beragoyla, Ois Katan Sadik, this is based on a Mordechai. If you look at the Mordechai, you'll see that this is based on the halacha that we had in Siman Kuf Nun, that tells us that when you build a shul, you're supposed to build the shul begoiva shel ir. The shul is supposed to be the high point of the city. And there are not supposed to be other houses in the city that are taller than the shul. The caveat being that it's houses, it's buildings that are used bederech kavua. Houses that are used cannot be taller than the shul. Decorative structures, those kinds of structures could be taller than the shul. But you cannot have structures that have stories, that are floors, that are being used on a permanent basis, that are higher than the shul. Therefore, says the Mordechai, if you go ahead and you build a shul, and the shul has an aliyah, the shul has a second story, then you cannot make use of that second story for any kind of tashmish shel gnai, because that would be using something that's taller than the shul. That's where the Mordechai is coming from. So now, let's kind of try and put this Sif Yud Beis in perspective. Yesh lizar milishtamesh ba'aliyah she'al gabe beis hakneses. We have an aliyah that is on top of a beis hakneses. Okay, if the Mechaber is talking about a beis hakneses, my assumption right now, and it's going to be borne out by the Hagah of the Ramah, my assumption right now is the Mechaber is addressing a typical case, a normal case, which would be the tzibbur got together and they built a beis hakneses. When they got together and they built a beis hakneses, one assumes that they built the beis hakneses kahalacha. So they went ahead, they built the beis hakneses. Hopefully they were able to build it begoiva shel ir. But this is a building that was built to be a beis hakneses. Okay, there's an upper story, there's an attic. Now they want to know, what could you use the attic for? Maybe there's somebody who uses the shul on a somewhat permanent basis. He's there, he davens there every morning, he learns there a few hours in the morning, maybe he learns there in the afternoon. Maybe we're even talking about the shamish of the shul. Maybe the shamish of the shul comes at 5 o'clock in the morning to open up the shul. He spends the whole morning over there. The shul is a minyan factory, minyan acha minyan acha minyan acha minyan until almost chatzos. Then he has a little bit of a break between chatzos and mincha gedola, because at mincha gedola, the mincha minyanim starts. So he wants to know, could he put a cot upstairs in the aliyah over the shul, and could he use it to sleep over there? Says the Mechaber, no, you can't do that. Why not? Because of the Mordechai. Because in essence, what you're doing is, even though you built a beautiful Beis HaKnesses, and hopefully you built it begoiva shel ir, hopefully there's no other structures in the city or houses in the city that are taller than it, but even if there are, maybe there are, because like we learned in Siman Kuf Nun, nowadays the minig is not to be so nizar in this, because we can't be nizar in it, because there are temples and churches and whatnot that are taller and we can't build taller than they are, or because of zoning laws or whatever it is. So we're not necessarily so nizar. But to go ahead and use the attic of the shul for a tashmish kavua, especially a tashmish kavua shel genai. Now, mind you, setting up a cot and sleeping, it's funny that the Mechaber picked that as a tashmish shel genai. That's a tashmish shel genai? To sleep is like a disgraceful way to use a room. But I think what the Mechaber might mean over here is, anytime you want to make permanent usage of a structure above the shul, that's a genayah to the shul. That's automatically a problem. So the Mechaber is saying a relatively simple halacha. You have a shul and you have an attic over the Beis HaKnesses. So remember that there's a halacha in Siman Kuf Nun that you're not supposed to make any kind of somewhat permanent usage higher than a Beis HaKnesses. So don't set up a cot in the attic of the shul to go to sleep. You want to set up a cot to go to sleep, use the basement of the shul. Set up your cot over there and let the shamash take a nap in the basement. The shamash shouldn't take a nap in the attic. Then says the Mechaber, Usha'ar tashmishim, when it comes to other types of usage, yesh lehistapik and mutar lehishtamisham. You want to use the attic for something, okay, so what are you going to use the attic for? Well, maybe you'll use the attic for some kind of storage. A Beis HaKnesses often has things that they need to store from season to season, right? You have, I'm thinking about in Yonah D'Yoma, hopefully it shouldn't be Nageya, but you have a box of kinnison that you have to put away for Tisha B'Av, and you have all of the Hanukkah paraphernalia, and maybe they do some selling also, so they have to put away the Hanukkah paraphernalia for the rest of the year except for Hanukkah, and they have to put away the Sukkot paraphernalia, and they have to store the bamboo and everything else. So you need storage space, you need different kind of spaces. Are you allowed to use the attic over the shul? Now, as far as the halacha of making use of an area higher than the Beis HaKnesses, I'm not sure. To me, it's not 100% the davar pashut that those kind of usages would be aser, because that's going to get back into the sugya of Siman Kuf Nun in Sif Beis on Lamed Aleph Amud Aleph. What are Beraniyos u'migdalim? The Ramah said that Beraniyos and Migdalim are binyanim ha'asuyim linoi. Others say that Beraniyos are fortresses. Migdalim maybe are fortresses. Those are certainly used. They're not used to live in. So exactly what kind of usages are mutter and what kind of usages are aser because of this halacha of making use of a place that's higher than the Beis HaKnesses, it could be that there are sha'ar tashmishim that would not be aser because of that halacha. But the iser of sleeping, that's like a bias. That's a living quarter. We know that that's included in the halacha of Kuf Nun. In Kuf Nun, you're not allowed to have living quarters that are taller than the shul. So if you built a Beis HaKnesses and you have an attic, you cannot set up the attic to be living quarters. Kigon lishkav sham. That you can't do, because that goes contrary to the halacha of Kuf Nun, and that is the halacha of the Mordechai, and that's the halacha that the Mechaber is saying over here. The second halacha of the Mechaber is usha'ar tashmishim, other types of usages that might not be also because of the halacha of Kuf Nun. Yesh lehistapek imutar lehishtamisham. Over there, there's a suffix whether or not you could make use of the attic of the shul when it doesn't fit into the halacha of Siman Kuf Nun. So if it doesn't fit into the halacha of Kuf Nun, why would it be aser? So let's take a look now at the Mishnah Berurah. So first says the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Kat Lamites Tashmish Kavua Miloshin there from the language of the Mechaber Mashbet is implied the Lishka Shabbaderch Mikre that if you just want to lay down there once in a while, mutter, that would be mutter. Why? Because you're not setting up living quarters. And in that case, it doesn't run contrary to Kofnun. So that would be mutter. That wouldn't be called, and the way I'm translating Tashmish Shel Gnai is not a disgraceful Tashmish. It wouldn't be called a Tashmish, which is now a Gnai to the Beis HaKnesses. Why is it a Gnai to the Beis HaKnesses? Because it runs contrary to the halakha of Kofnun that says that mitam covered Beis HaKnesses, you're not allowed to have living quarters taller than the Beis HaKnesses. So again, the first halacha of Yud Beis is you have a Beis HaKnesses, you can't set up living quarters in the attic. Why? Kufnun. That's why. That's why you can't do it. Sha'ar Tashmishim, over there we have a suffix. What's the suffix of Sha'ar Tashmishim? The suffix is that Sha'ar Tashmishim don't run contrary to Kufnun. But there might be a different problem with Sha'ar Tashmishim in the aliyah, in the attic of a Beis HaKnesses. What would the problem be over there? The problem, sorry, give me a second there, okay. The problem over there would be a problem of Kiddushas Beis HaKnesses, not covered Beis HaKnesses of Siman Kuf Nun, but Kiddushas Beis HaKnesses. Is there a question that the Kiddusha of the Beis HaKnesses itself extends to the aliyah? And then if in that case, to say, well, you're not going to set up a cot and take a nap in the Beis HaKnesses, you can't do it in the aliyah either. Why is that a suffix? So for that, let's see Ois Kat Mem. Yesh lehistapik. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the suffix is like this. I'll give you outside first. If you look in the Mishnayos, in the Gemaras, in Masechtas Midos, in Tamid, in other places, it is apparent that both the Heichal of the Beis HaMikdash itself, so that's the structure of the building of the Beis HaMikdash itself, which incorporated the Heichal, where the Menorah, the Mizbeach Hazav, the Shulchan was, the Kachei Kacha, where the Aron HaKodesh was, so the structure of the Beis HaMikdash itself, and various parts of the Azara, the courtyards, outside the Beis HaMikdash, so where the Mizbeach, where the main Mizbeach was, and then outside where the main Mizbeach, even further outwards, the building of the Beis HaMikdash itself had aliyos, it had attics. There were upstairs rooms. And in the Azara also, there were gagin, there were rooftops, there were roofs over various parts of the Azara. Even where there weren't roofs, there were walls, the upper surfaces of the walls. So these upper rooms, or these upper surfaces, did they have Kedusha or did they not have Kedusha? From the Gemara, it's apparent that the rooftops, the tops of the walls, etc. of the Azara were not Niskadesh. But the aliyos of the Heichal were Niskadesh. Based on this, the Mishnah Berurah says over here in Ois Kat Mem, that's the source of our suffix when it comes to the aliyah of a shul. Is the aliyah of a shul to be compared to the aliyah of the Heichal, or is the aliyah of the shul to be compared to the aliyah of the Azara? If we're going to compare it to the aliyah of the various parts of the Azara, so then there's no Kedusha. But if we're going to be medamit to the aliyahs of the Heichal, then it does have Kedusha. So let's see it inside here. Nice cut mem. Yesh le'estapek, what's the question? Im le'damoisai la'aliyahis ha'azara, do we compare the aliyah over the shul to the upper stories, rooftops, etc. of the Azara, the loy niskachu, that were not sanctified? Oy, keven the Beis HaKnesses the Beis HaMedrash nikra migdash ma'at, or perhaps, since we've already learned that a Beis HaKnesses and a Beis HaMedrash are referred to as a migdash ma'at, yesh l'damoisai la'aliyah's heichal, we should compare them to the upper stories of the Heichal itself. The Kaimalon did Niskachu b'Kedushas Heichal. The Gemara in Psakim says that the aliyahs of the Heichal were Niskadish with the Kedusha of the Heichal. If so, then the aliyah of the Beis HaKnesses or of the Beis HaMedrash have the Kedusha of the Beis HaMedrash and the Beis HaKnesses, and in that case, you cannot use it for Sha'ar Tashmishim. Ulefi masha kasa b'shari tshuva b'shem tshuvas pe'er hadar yesh lahakol, comes out that we could be mekel. Chutz mimakom shal gabe ahechel, with the exception of the area directly over the Aron Kodesh. Ritzayna loimer ha'aron shesham munach ha'sefer Torah, sham yesh lihizayer shaloi lihishtamei sham. Now, the Aruch HaShulchan is bothered right away by really a very significant kasha. The Aruch HaShulchan says he doesn't understand what this doubt is. Because the way the Mishnah Berurah presents the doubt, he says, look, we have the aliyahs of the Azara. The aliyahs of the Azara were not Niskadesh. The aliyahs of the Heichel, those were Niskadesh. All right, the basic Knesset, the basic Medrash, Migdash Ma'at. Okay, if it's a Migdash Ma'at, do we go after the Heichel and say the aliyah is Niskadesh? Or do we go after the Azara and say the aliyah is not Niskadesh? That's the way the Mishnah Berurah presents the suffix. The Aruch HaShulchan turns around, the Aruch HaShulchan says, I don't understand. I'll read it to you from the Aruch HaShulchan. The Aruch HaShulchan says, I don't understand. If you take a look at the Gemara Pesachim Pei Hayom and Beis, it is very clearly implicated. Deminadin kol kedusha shal bayis loy tispashet al hagagin v'al ha'aliyos. It's very clear from the Sugi in Pesachim that by itself the kedusha is not nispashet. The kedusha does not go to the gagin and to the aliyos. And that's why in the Azara, the Gagin and the Aliyas are not Niskadesh. Ubehechel mefurish bekrashe kitchu Aliyas ayin sham. But in the Heichel, they were Mikadesh, the Gagin and the Aliyas. In other words, it's not a question of din. It's not a question that we have one halacha in the Azara. In the Azara, the halacha was they were Mikadesh the Azara. And the Kedusha, when they were Mekadesh the Azara, it was not nispashet. It didn't automatically extend to the Gagin and the Aliyos. But in the Heichel, they were Mekadesh the Heichel, and that Kedusha automatically was nispashet to the Gagin and the Aliyos. Says the Aruch HaShulchan, no, that's not what comes out from the Sugya. What comes out from the Sugya is, Sai in the Azara, Sai in the Heichel, the Kedusha does not automatically extend up to the Gagin and the Aliyos. The reason the Aliyos of the Heichel were Niskadesh is because the Klal Yisrael were Mekadesh, the Gagin and the Aliyos of the Heichel. In the Azara, they were not Mekadesh, the Gagin and the Aliyos. By the Heichel, they were Mekadesh, the Gagin and the Aliyos. By our Batek Nisiyos, we're not Mekadesh, the Gagin and the Aliyos. So if we're not Mekadesh, why should we have a suffix that it's automatically Mekudesh? Says the Aruch HaShulchan, what we have to say is that we're not speaking here me'ikar adin. We're speaking here about a question of whether we should make a zecher lemigdash. In the words of the Aruch HaShulchan, what he says is, "V'nira dalav me'ikar dina kamistapki." This is not a suffix really be'ikar adin. El ulai roy lasei zichroin b'migdash ma'at kemoi b'kedushas heichel. Our HaShulchan says, our question is, since the Beis HaKnesset and the Beis HaMedrash are called a Migdash Ma'at, maybe we should make a Zeichel Migdash, and the same way we were Mekadesh, the Gagin and the Aliyos in the Heichel, we should be Mekadesh, the Gagin and the Aliyos in the Beis HaKnesset and the Beis HaMedrash, and therefore they cannot be used for Sha'ar Tashmishim. Okay. Now, let's take a look at the Ramah. Says the Ramah, here on the bottom line, Lamed Gimel Lamed Beis, in the Shulchan Aruch Hagah. The Chol Zeh Dafka Bebeis HaKnesses Kavua. This is only Negeya to a Beis HaKnesses Kavua, a shul that was built. They went and they built a Beis HaKnesses. That's when we have this Shaila. We built the Beis HaKnesses. It has an attic. Now we have a Shaila. What can we do with the attic? Could the Shamish put a cot in the attic and take a nap? Could we use it for other things? We're talking about a building that was built to be a shul. Avo bayis sheyichadoy la'acha shenivne lebeis hakneses. But if a building was built, and then after the building was built, they went ahead and they turned it into a shul, motor lishkav alav, then there's no suffix, then you're allowed to go, you're allowed to sleep on top of it, you're allowed to do whatever you want. And I think this, again, is where we see this question of whether or not it fits into the sugya of Siman Kuf Nun or not. Because we saw this in Kuf Nun as well. We saw in Kuf Nun that this whole question of having places that are taller than the shul, that's only negaya when you're going to go find a place to go build a shul. But if you're not building a shul, you have a tzibbur that needs a place to get together to daven. So you find an apartment that's up for rent. Are you allowed to go rent the apartment and use it for a shul? Yes, you are. Are you going to now throw out the upstairs neighbors and tell them they're not allowed to sleep over the shul? No, they are allowed to sleep over the shul. Why? Because now the halacha of Kuf Nun is not negeya. Nobody went to go build a shul. That's not how the shul ended up over here. The shul didn't end up over here because the tzibbur selected a location for the shul that was taller than anything else. And now we have a shiloh. Oh, there's an attic over the shul. Are we allowed to use it for this? Are we not allowed to use it for that? That's not what happened. That's not what happened over here. A building has been in existence for 30 years. Now we needed a place to daven. We found a place that we could go ahead and daven. There's 40 places in town that are all taller than the shul. In that case, the Ramah says the shiloh does not start. Says the Mishnah Berurah cut mem aleph avabaya sheyichadoi v'nira de kolshkein in b'shosh nivne beis hakneses. Certainly, if at the time that they built the shul, nivne beis dira lamayla mimenu, they built it. Somebody went and built a 4-story building. And he had in mind that the first floor is going to be a shul. And the upstairs 3 floors are going to be apartments to rent out, maybe even to raise money for the shul. The near the kolshken in b'shasha nivne beis hakneses nivne beis dira lamayla mimenu to shari ladersham. It's zichah mutter to live there. Why? Well, first of all, obviously then the halakha of Kuf Nun doesn't kick in. If the halakha of Kuf Nun was going to kick in, what was the heter to build this building and make the shul on the first floor in the first place? Elamai, whatever your heter was, you had a heter to go build a 4-story building and make a shul on the first floor. It was a situation where you can't do it otherwise. You can't make it on the top floor. There are other structures that are already taller, so we're not nizar in that halacha. But for whatever reason, the halacha of Kuf Nun is not kicking in. So now that the halacha of Kuf Nun didn't kick in, are you allowed to sleep above the shul? Yes, you're allowed to sleep above the shul. The question of Kedusha, the second halacha here of Sif Yud Beis, Kedushas Beis HaKnesses. Do we compare it to the Heichal and say that the upper story is Niskadesh? Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. Then certainly you weren't Mekadesh the upper stories. You built it lechatchila in this way. You built it mamish al tanai. But to do mamish a disgusting usage upstairs from the shul, ketinuf, the kayotzim is there, really dirty things, near the b'chal gavni aser, that would always be aser. V'alkein ein lasis klal beis hakneses im yesh ba'dir shalamayla mimenu davar meguna kazeh. V'ayin sham shekasav shenenesh pazeh harbe. Brings down the Taz. The Taz says a shrekel story. The Taz says that he lived above a beis hakneses, and he says he was punished for living above a beis hakneses, and he lost a child because he lived above a beis hakneses. The Aruch HaShulchan is metama on the Taz, but the Taz, this is what the Taz says. The Mishnah Berurah says there's a minig, it's well established that in different cities they go ahead and they rent an apartment for a shul, and upstairs over the shul there are people living there with little kids who soil their diapers, etc., which is tinuf. He says that maybe because that's temporary, it's okay. Even in all of these cases, with all of the Aterim, the Mishnah Berurah says that if you could avoid going and using an aliyah over a shul for something like a living quarter, if you could avoid it, and certainly if it's above the Aron Kodesh. Okay. Now we move along to Siman Kuf Nun Beis. Siman Kuf Nun Beis is a Siman that's very often Nogeya. Shaloi listar shum beis hakneses, the Isser to knock down a shul. Ubay sif echad, and here we have one sif. So there are a couple of hakdamus that I think we have to make to this sif. The first one is, I would ask you to turn the page to Lamed Daled Amud Beis and take a look at the Ramah. So we have a Ramah here, 1, 2, 3, 3 lines off the bottom. The Hagah of the Ramah, 3 lines off the bottom on Lamed Daled Amud Beis. Says the Ramah, Hagah, Va'aser likach avonim mi beis hakneses hayeshana. You are not allowed to remove stones from an old shul, kedei livnois chadasha, in order to build a new shul. Says the Ramah further, Va'aser listar davar mi beis hakneses. You're not allowed to destroy a part of a beis hakneses, ela im kein oisa almanas livnois, unless you're doing the demolition in order to be able to rebuild. So here we have the Ramah introduces an Isser to us that we really need at the beginning of the Siman in order to understand the very beginning of the Siman. And that is an Isser to destroy a Beis HaKnesses. In his words, Asar listar davar mi Beis HaKnesses. You're not even allowed to destroy a part of a shul unless you're doing demolition in order to rebuild. What is this Isser? So this Isser is an Isser Daraisa. Take a look at the Mishnah Berurah over here on Lamed Daled Amud Beis. Mishnah Berurah is cutting Yod Aleph. Says the Chavetz Chaim, V'asa listar davar. Why? What Isser is this? The heavy kinoitates even min ha'hechel. This is the same Isser as knocking a stone out of the Beis Hamikdash. The Asr, which is Asr, Mishum Shenemar, because the Pasuk says that when you come into Eretz Yisrael, v'nitatztem es mizbechaisam, you should destroy their altars, their mizbechais, the avodah zaras. You should destroy their mizbechais, and then the pasuk says, "Lo sasun kein laHashem Elokeichem," but do not do the same thing to Hashem your God. So the halach is you're required to destroy the batei ovdei koichavim and the mizbechais of the ovdei koichavim, but there's an Isser lav lo sasun kein laHashem Elokeichem. Says the Chavetz Chaim, ubeis hakneses ubeis hamedrash gam kein nikra migdash ma'at. A beis hakneses ubeis hamedrash is a migdash ma'at. So there's an Isser daraisa on destroying a beis hakneses. Now let's turn back to Lamed Daled Amud Aleph, to the beginning of Siman Kuf Nun Beis. So the very first thing that you have to know as Akdama for Siman Kuf Nun Beis is that there's an Isser daraisa to do demolition on a beis hakneses. That's the first thing you need to know. Second thing you have to know, there is a heter. What's the heter? If you're doing stira almanas livnois, if you're destroying it in order to rebuild it, that's not called demolition. That's not called v'nitatztem es loisasun kem Hashem Elokeichem. By the base of the kechavim, you do demolition in order to demolish it, leave it demolished. By the shul, what you're doing is you're doing demolition as part of reconstruction. That's construction. And therefore, that is a heter. That's mutter. Okay, that's the first thing you need to know. Then, you need to know a Gemara. Gemara in Baba Basra. Gemara in Baba Basra. Amar of Chisda. Loy listar inish bei kinishta, let's say you want to destroy a shul in order to rebuild it. You want to build, you have a little old shul, you want to knock it down to rebuild a pe'er, to rebuild a beautiful shul in its place. Lo listar inish be'kenishta, you cannot destroy a shul ad debani b'nei kenishta achriti, until you build a new shul. Which right away, in order to knock down a shul, to rebuild a shul in the same place, huge problem. But let's say you want to knock down a shul and you want to build a new shul somewhere else. You cannot knock down the original shul until you complete building the new shul. Not until you start, not until you're halfway done. You have to complete the building of the new shul. Only then are you allowed to knock down the old shul. So again, Amr of Chista, lo lister inish be'kenishta, a person is not allowed to knock down a shul ad debani be'kenishta achriti, until he builds a new shul. So again, is it daraisa to destroy a shul? The heter to destroy a shul is if you're destroying the shul in order to build a new one. But that heter only exists if you build the new one first. If you build the new one first, then you could knock down the old one. Which, by the way, is right away going to beg a question, which is, you're telling me that it's usher to knock down a shul. The only heter to knock down the shul is if I'm knocking it down so I could build a new one. Now you're telling me I'm not allowed to knock it down until I already built the new one. If I already built the new one, what heter do I have now to knock down the old one? I'm not knocking down the old one in order to build the new one. I already built the new one. We're going to have to get to that. That's going to be a complicated question. But that's what the Gemara says here. Amr of Chista, lo lister inish be'kenishta, debani be'kenishta achriti. Now the Gemara asks, what's the reason? Why? So the Gemara says, now you'll say, what do you mean why? Because it's also to knock down a shul. Yeah, but if I'm knocking it down in order to build a new one, that's a heter. So why do I have to build a new one first? Let me knock down the old one and then go build a new one. Why do I bedafka have to build a new one first? So the Gemara gives two reasons. There are those that say, because we're afraid, you know what's going to happen? You're going to knock down the old shul. And then after you knock down the old shul, the zoning board is going to give you trouble. There are going to be cost overruns. There's going to be a supply chain crisis. There's going to be COVID. There's going to be this. There's going to be that. And before you know it, you're not going to build the new shul. So you went and you knocked down the old shul based on the heter that you're knocking it down to build a new shul. But then you're going to be paisheya, which literally means you're going to be negligent, and you're never going to build the new shul. So Chazal said, midaraisa, you're allowed to knock down the old shul in order to build a new shul. But midrabanan, the Chazal said, you're not allowed to knock down the old shul until you finish building the new shul. But then there's another. There are those that say that the reason why you have to finish building the new one first is a different reason. Mishum tzeluye. What does that mean? Mishum tzeluye means literally because of davening. You can't knock down the old shul before you build the new shul, because once you knock down the old shul, where are people gonna daven? So it's a davar pashut. You know why you can't knock down the old shul? Because you need the old shul. You're gonna knock down the old shul, you're gonna be busy building the new shul, where are people gonna daven? You need a place to daven. So, okay, so we have a Gemara that's, again, let's back up. Is it daraisa, you're not allowed to knock down a shul? Heter to knock down a shul is if you're knocking it down in order to build a new one. That takes away the Yisr Daraisa. Came along the Chazal, Rav Chista says, you're not allowed to knock down the old shul until you finish building the new shul. Now we have two Ikeda Amris in the Gemara. Why? One says you have to finish building the new shul first, because we're afraid if you knock down the old shul before you finish the new shul, you're never going to end up building the new shul. The other Ikeda Amri says, no, very pragmatic. The reason you can't knock down the old shul until you build the new shul is because you need a place to pray. You need a place to daven. If we're going to let you knock down the old shul, now you don't have a place to daven. Now everyone's going to get used to davening in tents and davening b'yechidus for the next 3 years while you build the new shul. And by the time you build the new shul, I don't know if anybody's showing up anymore. That's two pshatim in the Gemara. Okay. Then the Gemara goes on, and the Gemara asks, Mai benayu? What's the difference between these two Ikeda Amris? Is there a halachic nafkamina what the reason for the Isser is? And the Gemara says, yeah, there's a very simple nafkamina. The nafkamina is, what if we prepared a new place to daven? We knew that we're throwing down the old shul, so we took out a 5-year lease on an apartment, and we have a place for the temporary Beis HaKnesses while the new shul is being built. So as far as tzeluye, as far as a place to daven, we have a place to daven. So that Man Amar would say, okay, so then it's no problem. You can knock down the old shul. But the Man Amar that says Mishum Pshiyusa, he would still have a problem. He would say, okay, it's very nice that you have a place to daven, but I still have to worry that you might not ever get around to rebuilding the Beis HaKnesses Kavua. You threw down a Beis HaKnesses Kavua, you rented an apartment for a temporary Beis HaKnesses, but maybe you're going to be Pasha and you're not going to build the Beis HaKnesses Kavua. So that would be the nafkamina lahalacha. Then the Gemara continues, and the Gemara says that Ravina asked Rav Ashi a shaila. Ravina asked Rav Ashi a shaila, and he said, what's the halacha if they already raised all the money for the new shul? So they already did the charity campaign and the matching campaign, and it's not just pledges, all of the money came in, and the Gabbai, who's in charge of building the new shul, already has all the money in the bank, and the permits, they already have the permits and everything else. In that case, are you allowed to knock down the old shul? So what was Ravina's shaila? Ravina's shaila, it seems, was he's basing his understanding on the Mandi Omar of Mishum Pshiyusa. Ravina is coming to Rav Ashi, and he's saying, okay, Rav Chisda said you're not allowed to throw down the old shul until you finish building the new shul. It seems that the reason is Mishum Pshiyusa. You're afraid that we're never going to get around to building the new shul. So now my shaila to you, Rav Ashi, is, what if we already raised all the money? All the money's in the bank. We already have all the permits, and the bull's odor is already ready to come. So now are you allowed to knock down the old shul before you put up the new shul? So it's very clear from this Gemara in Baba Basra that Ravina's understanding was that we paskin like the Mandi Omar, that the reason you're not allowed to throw down the old shul before you put up the new shul is Mishum Pshiyusa. And the Mechaber in the Beis Yosef paskins that way, and seemingly here in Siman Kuf Nun Beis in the Shulchan Aruch, he also paskins that way. So against this whole backdrop, let's take a look here at what the Mechaber says. Siman Kuf Nun Beis, Shaloi listar shum Beis HaKnesses, that you're not allowed to do demolition on a shul. Ubay sif echad, and here we have one sif. Says the Mechaber sif aleph, ein soisrin Beis HaKnesses. You're not allowed to destroy a shul. Kidei livnois Beis HaKnesses acher, in order to build a new shul. Why aren't you allowed to do it? Shema ye'era lehem oinis, because maybe some kind of unforeseen circumstances will arise, an oinus will take place, shaloi yivnu ha'acher, and you'll end up never building the new shul. Ella, rather, what do you have to do? Bainim ha'acher tchila, you have to build the new shul first, v'achakach soisra v'yoshan, and then you could throw down the old shul. So now, against the whole backdrop that I gave, this is very easy to understand. Let's take a look here. Mishnah Berurah Katan Aleph, Beis HaKnesses. First, the Mishnah Berurah just makes the point, even though the Mechaber says Beis HaKnesses, hu adin Beis HaMedrash. The same halacha applies to a Beis Medrash. Ubein shel yachid, and this is the same whether it's a private Beis Medrash, which I think means privately held, privately owned. An individual owns a Beis HaMedrash, and he allows people to come and use it, but it's privately owned. It doesn't belong to the tzibbur. He can't decide to go knock it down. So, I'm not allowed to knock it down. It's my building. I can't do what I want. No, you can't. It's a Beis HaMedrash. You can't knock it down. Aisha Rabim, or it belongs to the tzibbur. It was built with tzibbur shigelt. The halacha applies to both, which is a chiddush. It applies even to the privately owned Beis HaMedrash. It's very nice that you decided to make a building into a Beis HaMedrash, but you made it into a Beis HaMedrash. Now you can't throw it down unless you build a new one first. Ice cotton Beis, the lashon of the Mechaber is, you can't destroy a Beis HaKnesses, kidei livnois Beis HaKnesses acher, in order to build a new one. You're not allowed to do that. Why? Because you might end up never building the new one. Says the Mishnah Berurah, he's cutting base, they live nice, what the Mechaber wants to say is, certainly if you don't intend to build another one, then it's definitely usher to throw down a basic Knesses. Why? Because of the Yisr Daraisa that we learned about on Amid Beis. It's an Yisr Lav. So when the Mechaber says, Ein sois from basic Knesses kidei live nice basic Knesses acher, you can't throw down a shul in order to build another one. What he means is, if you're not building another one, you certainly can't throw it down. But even if you want to build another one, so you have a heter, and you get out of the Yisr of Loisasin Kei Lashem Lekechem, you still can't do it unless you build a new one first. Even if you're throwing it down in order to replace it with a new one, either in the same place, or in a different place, the Aser, it's Aser. Even though you want to build a much bigger, much more beautiful one, you still can't do it until you build the new one. Ice cut and gimel, basic Knesses acher. The same thing would be if you want to throw down a basic Knesses in order to build a Beis HaMedrash which has more Kedusha. Even though a Beis HaMedrash has more Kedusha, you still can't do it. High time in the Messiah, because you might not end up building it. Right. Let's say you rented, let's say the tzibbur rented a Beis HaKnesses. So the tzibbur went ahead and they took out a 5-year lease on a building for a Beis HaKnesses. And now they're in year 5 of the lease. And the board is getting together and they're having a meeting. Should we re-up the lease on this building? Or maybe we want to lease a new building? Or maybe we want to build, I don't know, this, that, the other thing. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Kasra Achroinim, Tehu adin kisha Beis HaKnesses muskeres lehem rak lizman. If the shul is leased to the tzibur for a set time period, v'daitam liskar achakach b'makam acher, and now they decided that they want to take out a new lease on a new location for the shul, aser lesalik es atzma mimakam erishain, they cannot give up the lease on the first location until they take on the lease in the new location. Same problem. You're davening here for 5 years. You're going to let the lease lapse, or you're going to give up the lease on this location before you have a lease on a new location? Maybe mishum pshiyusa. Maybe you won't get a new lease. Maybe you won't find one. Or maybe something will come up. Maybe you'll decide not to. So you're going to be mevatel Beis HaKnesses. So you cannot let yourself out of the original lease until you replace it with a new lease. Ice cut and dalid, we're afraid of an oinus. Some kind of oinus might come up. Even if the gabbai has all the money, this is what we saw in the Gemara. Ravina Shaila to Ravashi. You already raised all the money. The steel and the cinder blocks and the bricks are all laying in the yard. You still can't throw down the old shul. Maybe suddenly a pidyon shvuyim will come up, and all the money that you raised for the shul, you're going to have to give for pidyon shvuyim, because that's the halacha. The halacha is if you raise money to build a shul, that pidyon shvuyim comes up, you give that money for pidyon shvuyim. You don't sell an existing shul for pidyon shvuyim. But if you raised money to build a shul, and now they need money for pidyon shvuyim, you have to give the money for pidyon shvuyim. Something will arise that will prevent you from building the new shul. And now you won't have a Beis HaKnesses kavua. Now here it gets very interesting. This is what we saw. This is what the Gemara said. Is there a nafkamina between the tuik and the amris? The Gemara said yes. And here we have it in the Mishnah Berurah. It's also to knock down the old shul, even if you have a place to daven. Right? Because that's not the Isser. We're not worried about you not having a place to daven. We know you're going to have a place to daven. The Isser is Mishum Pshiyusa. The Isser is, it's very nice that you have a place to daven. but maybe you're never going to end up building the new Beis HaKnesses Kavua. And we want to make sure that you have the Beis HaKnesses Kavua. V'heicha de'ika oid Beis HaKnesses Kavua ba'ir. But how about this, Shaila? Let's say you're in a city, and the city has 5 Batei Knesses Kavua. There's a Young Israel, and there's an Aguda, and there's a Sradish Shul, and there's a I don't know what, and there's a Chassidish Shtibel, and there's a Beis Avad. Yeah, you have 6 Batei Knesses Kavua in the Shul. Every one of them is a big, beautiful building. So there's no lack of Batei Knesses Kavua. So now does the same halacha still apply? If you want to throw down one of the shuls, you can't do it until you build the new one? Why? What's the problem? There's not going to be any lack of a Beis HaKnesses Kavua. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'heicha de'ika oid Beis HaKnesses Kavua ba'ir. When you have another Beis HaKnesses Kavua in the city, she'cholim lehispal sham kulam, and it's got plenty of room, everybody could daven there. So now we have a machlokes haposkim. Hataz matir. The Taz is matir. V'hamagen Avram oiser b'chal gavni, and the Magen Avram still asers it v'ayin b'bir alacha. It seems that the machlokes of the Taz and the Magen Avram is like this. Everybody agrees. You see, here's an interesting question. I want to demolish a Beis HaKnesses Kavua. I'm not allowed to do it. So nobody holds that if you have 5 Batei Knesses Kavua in a city, you're just allowed to pick one and throw it down. No, you're not allowed to. That's it is a daraisa. So I don't care how many Batei Knesses Kavua there are in the city. You have no heter to destroy a Beis HaKnesses unless you're planning on building a new one. The halacha is that normally you have to build the new one first before you throw down the old one, because we're chayshish v'shum pshiyusa. We're afraid if you throw down the old one, you may never end up building the new one. Now the shaila comes, how about if I have other Batei Knesses Kavua in the city? Why is that a shaila? Why should it be mutter? So the Taz is materit. Why is the Taz materit? Because the Taz says like this. Why were the Chazal misakin that you have to put up the new one before you throw down the old one? Mishum pshiyusa. Because we're afraid you might be pasheya and you might not end up putting up the new one. The Taz says they weren't really worried about a pshia la'olam. They weren't really worried that you will never put up the new one. They're afraid it was going to schlep out. And it's going to take you a long time to put up the new one. And you're not going to feel the pressure to put up the new one. Says the Taz, but if there are other Batei Knesses Kavua in the city, then we don't have to be so machber. Says the Magen Avram, no. I don't care if there are other Batei Knesses in the city. The Taganas Chazal is bim kaimai oimedes. Okay. You have to build the new shul first. You have to finish the new shul. Even if you didn't use it yet, you could already knock down the old one. Because once the shul is already built, we don't have to worry that a Pidyon Shvuyim is going to come up and you're going to sell the shul, because that's not the halacha. You're not mechuyev to sell the shul. Once you build the new shul, then you could knock down the old shul. Even if the shul that you're talking about knocking down is a Beis HaKnesses shel krachim. A krach is a big city. There's a very interesting halacha when it comes to the shul of a big city. And that is, which Mishnah Berurah says over here, Ta'afilu haya Beis HaKnesses shel krachim demavur lekamam b'sibik uftud gimel sif zayin da'anche ir ein yechel lamachrei b'shum gavna. A shul in a big city, the people in the city, the members of the shul, are not allowed to sell it. Why? Because when you have a shul in a big city, that shul is not there to serve the city that it's in and to serve its members. A shul in a metropolis is there to serve all Klal Yisrael. What's Pshat? Pshat is very simple. When you have a shul in Brooklyn, when you have a shul in Borough Park, a shul in Borough Park is not there only to serve the people who live in the 5 blocks around it. It's there to serve all of the people who come into Brooklyn all the time. People are always traveling into Brooklyn. People are always traveling into Lakewood. So a shul in Lakewood is not considered to be there to serve the people of Lakewood. It's considered to be there to serve Klal Yisrael. People from all over are coming there, literally, internationally. People are coming there all the time. And therefore, the people of the city aren't allowed to sell it. What does that have to do with us? Kasav Amagid of Rabbi Shema Master Binyamin. Da filo haya beis hakneset shel krachim de bavula kamam zibikov de gibel sev zayin dan sheir ein lechel amakar b'shem gavda. De bestama b'nou adaita de kulei alma, because that shul was built to serve the whole world. V'shema yesh echad ba'olam de leinichale b'mechirazu. So you have to worry that there are people who aren't going to be agreeable to the sale. Hachashari, to knock down a shul, if you build. Again, you're not allowed to knock down a shul. You're only allowed to knock down a shul if you build a new shul. You can't knock down the old shul until you build the new shul. What if it's a Beis HaKnesset shel Krachim? Are you allowed to build a new shul and then throw down the old shul if it's a Beis HaKnesset shel Krachim? Says the Mishnah Berurah, yes. Because this everybody would agree with. Because what do you mean? You're building them up a bigger, nicer shul than there was before, so you don't have to be concerned about this halacha of Beis HaKnesset shel Krachim. Okay, Baruch Hashem, we did a lot because we finished Lamed Gimel Lamed Beis, we did Lamed Daled Lamed Aleph, and we already did really a good piece of Lamed Daled Lamed Beis as well. So, thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Discussing limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. Rebbeinu Shalom should send Yeshua's refuahs, Parnasit Sheduchim Tol those in need. We should be zeichet to see the Bias Gal Tzedek, B'mehera v'yameinu, Amen. Be well.